Greetings! It is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the various campaign settings of Dungeons & Dragons, many of which date back to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And of course, where we started off with Spelljammer, Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in Space! Alright, let's continue where we were talking about with combat, between ships in particular. So, we talked about all the long-range combat, fighting between two different hexes over large periods of time, blasting each other with large-scale weapons. Let's talk about short-range combat. Short-range combat occurs when two ships enter the same hex. They are within close proximity to each other. At this point in time, short-range or handheld weapons are more likely used. You can still get some of that large-scale weapons fighting against each other, but more or less, basically, the crew on deck can fire off their little weapons, their crossbows, their bows. Pretty much any option you normally would have in combat is an option once you've hit that short range. Whatever you could theoretically do normally, you can do at this point in time. So in the course of this combat, your ship enters the other hex. Everybody aboard your ship, all the players, they get their attacks on this ship. Once that is complete, the ship whose hex you entered, the one that you just attacked, has the option of firing their handheld weapons and their large weapons back at you. Then, if there are other ships in that hex, they have the option of firing too. Basically, you trigger off all this firing at each other upon entering the hex. After which, you have a couple of options, at least your ship does. You can then ram the other ship, but to do this, you need to have some initiative on them in order to successfully ram them. Or, you can try to grapple the other ship, throw grappling ropes and attach each other together so that the two of you are now locked together. You can also try to board at this point in time. You can throw a couple of men with melee handheld weapons aboard the opponent's ship, jumping aboard, ready to fight whoever they find on board and try to take it over. So you can see there's a couple of different options here. Now you can take none of those options with you, the attacking ship to begin with. You can just sail off. But the ship you just attacked has the option of attempting a grapple or board because you attacked them. They can attempt that back. But again, you had the action here. You can get that ram. Now to keep things simple, when you're in the same hex, missile combat is fought at a medium range. At whatever the medium range for your weapon is, that's what you're fighting at once you're in the same air envelope. Now, this doesn't mean you can't change that range there, but we're keeping it simple because you never know how they're changing dynamically. As soon as the two of them meet and their air envelopes overlap, you're at your shortest range. So that's when you hit that shortest range of yours. Because normally out in that space, you've got that longer range for firing across multiple hexes, no matter how many hexes it is. We keep things simple here so you don't have to keep measuring the distance between these two ships as they are probably constantly shifting. Now, your short and your medium range combat are exactly the same as if they would be with the long range, except you have a new option once you've hit that medium or short range. I can much easier target people on deck. Now, rather than just firing at I'm firing at the crew. I hit someone randomly. I'm just firing at something moving on deck. I can't really tell who's who. Now I can be like, oh, there's that guy over there. I'm targeting him. Now, the fact is that most of the time when you do have targeting crew, it's because there are certain orders that are given. Traditionally, the orders are given, shoot anybody with arrows that looks like a wizard. That's a very traditional sort of order that's given, so you can kind of ping into that wizard guy. Now, granted, the guy over there just might be an old man in a beard with kind of robes that has nothing to do with being a wizard, but he's being targeted because he's obviously both a backup helmsman and a danger to you because of spells. So yes, there are biases on who you're going to be targeting. That's probably the largest one that's given order from. But this only occurs, granted, again, if you're at that medium or short range where I can specifically target someone. Now, if I'm at these ranges, some of your long-range weapons can be used. Things like catapults have a kind of minimum distance that they can fire at, so you might not be able to use them. But ballistas could too. Though you could fire something like a ballista at the enemy deck, because that's seemingly what is visible to you. It's the option you have. Large-scale weapons don't have the same luxury as the short-scale weapons. They're pretty much just sort of Who's on deck? I'm firing at something on deck. Do I hit one of them? I got lucky. You have to also remember that for personal weapons, for these like bows, arrows, crossbows, if I'm hitting the enemy ship, I have to do 10 points of damage to the same spot, exact same spot, to do 1 point of hull damage. Otherwise, it just pinks into the ship and doesn't really do anything. Now let's talk about magic when it comes to this entire thing, because magic's being basically unlocked now that we are in the same hex. Now, as long as you're casting a spell that can at least go 100 yards, if you're in the same hex, you can assume that I can hit the enemy ship or anybody on the ship with said spell. I have the distance, I have the range for it. Effectively, for most editions nowadays, this would be considered long-range spells. That's what I can. I can hit someone with my fireball. I can chuck it at the enemy ship once I'm at short combat, close combat, in the same hex. This isn't to say I couldn't use other spells, but those spells were more likely going to be used on my allies, myself, or if we get into things like grappling or boarding, I could then use my shorter range spells on the enemy ship. I get that options once we actually get really close in. Now, when it comes to magic, it functions exactly the same way as any kind of personal weapons you have. What I mean by this is, when you target crew with magic, it does the normal damage it would do. If I target a ship with damage, for every 10 points of damage that spell does, I do a hull point. Much the same way of a personal weapon. 10 points, 1 hull point. The advantage with the spell is I don't have to target a particular point. Just doing damage with the spell to the ship is enough to start getting those hull points taken care of. I just have to make sure I'm doing a whole bunch of damage to it. Like if I hit it with a fireball, it's going to do some damage to the hull. Of course, there might be secondary effects with something like the fireball of lighting the ship on fire, and that would be an advantage that I would have over the other ship. But again, this is the uses of the spells. Now, the fact is that there are some spells which alter the way that they do things. They don't do things exactly the same way as they would, for example, with your fireball. Fireball is standard. It does damage, does fire, could burn things, but other spells would work differently on ships. A good example of this is Disintegrate. Disintegrate normally just does a whole lot of damage to something. It basically can turn it to dust. It effectively can cause it to just go poof into dust. When I hit Disintegrate into a ship, I don't do damage to that ship. I hull it like the critical hit. Effectively, the area I hit with the Disintegrate just goes away. It opens up a hole in the ship, which has its own ramifications of new areas that can be targeted, things like that. So there is some alteration there. All other things like warping wood just can weaken a few boards, but it could be used on a ballista or a catapult to disable it. Dispel Magic even works on an enemy ship. It effectively reduces the helm's operation to 0 for a turn. It disables the spell jamming helm for an entire turn, which can be very useful. You should make another ship dead in the water for just a little bit of time, allowing you to open up a kind of attack against them. You can see that these spells have different effects because of this, and there are some spell information provided which we'll talk about later on in the book, but otherwise, it's going to be up to your dungeon master to determine exactly how a spell will interact with a spell jamming ship. Again, crew is just standard. They're crew that are there. But the helm itself and the ship itself, they will have their own interactions. Now, ramming. It is a common tactic to use to damage or break up enemy ships. Something you can do to sort of finish them off. The fact is that this is best done if you're using a ship that has the same or actually smaller tonnage than the ship you're ramming into. Now, in simple AD&D terms, before initiative is determined, that is when the ship who wants to ram announces their intention to ram. The reasoning behind this is that ramming takes a lot of maneuvering, preparation, you have to get yourself aligned, various things like that that take a lot of time. In most other editions, it would be assumed before any kind of turn would be taken, starting at the highest initiatives, that ramming would be both discussed and announced. It's still the same sort of thing that your ship has to announce ahead of time, I'm going to be attempting a ram. Now, unfortunately, ramming is just not a spur-of-the-moment thing. Gear that's loose has to be battened down, the crew has to be prepared, and it's because of all the maneuvering to get in the right position to actually hit. You can't just do it. Otherwise, it's just going to be a glancing blow. You'll bounce off of each other. Damage won't be dealt. You need to get that kind of shear onto it, straightforward smack into it to get that proper ram and get some actual damage in. Now, there are some restrictions when it comes to ramming. First off, I can't ram a ship that I'm starting in the same hex with. Because we're in such close quarters, I can't maneuver myself into a position to easily hit them and get the right damage. Now, over the course of my turn, if my ship leaves this hex, wheels around somehow, comes back in and smacks it, then that's fine. You would have to just leave the hex and come back in order to get that ram attack and get it properly. Also, if we're grappled together and kind of connected together, I can't ram them. Because we're already grappled and in short range anyway, and we can't separate from each other for me to wheel around and get my ramming in. Now you can only attempt a ram a turn. Because of the nature of everything that's going on and the maneuvering that is, you can't just sort of try to ram and then maybe wheel around and try it again if you were in a position to do that. Or try to ram this guy and then somehow turn and try to ram a guy over there. You only get one attempt per turn. Now, when determining ramming success, you look to the helmsman. Whatever the helmsman attack bonus is, that's the attack bonus you're going to be using in order to connect with the ram. Now, granted, depending on your edition, depends on if there is advantage and disadvantage. If we're talking 5th edition, then there's no real advantage between a wizard or a cleric. If we're talking 3rd edition or even 2nd edition, then you're probably going to want some kind of priest/cleric in that helm rather than a wizard because they have a greater base attack bonus. So you can see there are some advantages overall, depending on the class and depending on the edition, as to who you want at the helm for this attack roll. Now, if it's a unique helm, which doesn't use an individual, that uses multiple creatures to use it, then rather than any one of the helmsman's attack bonus, you in fact look to the navigator and use whatever their attack bonus would be if they were at half of their level. That means half of their base attack, if we're talking base attack, half of what their THAC0 would be if we're talking AD&D, or half of their proficiency bonus, or half of what their proficiency would be at half their level if we're talking the 5th edition. Regardless, it's just think of it this way, half level, that's what their attack bonus would be. You treat it as if they're that. Now, depending on the type of ram you have, depends on the type of damage it does. There are 3 standard types of rams. I will not go into the exact details of all of them. I'll just mention a few things. A pierce ram does damage based upon its tonnage, has the enemy ship both suffer the shaken and the hold criticals, and there's a chance that the 2 ships can be locked together because of this. Blunt rams, once again, do damage based upon the tonnage of the ship that's dealing it. They do the shaken critical on the ship, and then 1 random critical, other than shaken, occurs to the enemy ship when you get hit with a blunt ram. Grapple rams do just that. Grapple rams don't do any damage to the opponents. They just grapple on so that they're attached together. They are made to connect 2 ships together, so both of them are considered that grappling, the grappled kind of ship-based condition. And then, of course, you can do things like boarding. But it's basically grapple the 2 of you together with a grapple ram. But, hey, that's it for today. We started talking about short-range combat in Spelljammer. We talked about your long-range weapons, your big siege weapons, your small handheld weapons, your magic, and we talked about ramming the crap out of each other. Wha-bam! In the next episode, I'm going to finish up talking about ramming while talking about a couple more details of it, and then we're going to move into an important part of all this, crashing. We're talking about a bit more of what's going to be happening to your ship post-ram and various other things that are occurring to it, as we continue to dive deeper into Spelljammer and its combat rules. But I hope you're having a great day. If you have any stories about Spelljammer or other interesting ship-based combat when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear the stories from you. But, regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.